Hi everyone, my name is Matt Williams. I am a tutor in politics and what is known as the Access Fellow at Jesus College here at the University of Oxford. Today I am in the Botanic Gardens, which is one of my favourite places in Oxford. I'm here today because I want to talk to you about stories, and specifically I've been asked to make this video by a bunch of fantastic schools in South Wales, in Merthyr Tydfil, so shout out to them. Why we're talking about stories is because we've been doing a project with those schools about asking big questions and being comfortable in not necessarily knowing the answers, and just feeling happy about being inquisitive and curious, and how to develop the skills of curiosity. And today I'm going to specifically walk you through a particular skill of deconstructive analysis, which sounds very grand, but is in fact actually completely intuitive, and it's the sort of thing that young children, toddlers even, are capable of. And it's a skill that as adults we sometimes suppress because we feel a little bit embarrassed about asking searching questions, and sometimes we just don't think about them. We don't give our brains the chance to reflect and to think deeply about the amazing puzzles that are all around us in the world and in the universe. So why stories? Well, my big question to start with this conversation of deconstructive analysis is, what are stories? And the reason for starting this particular video here is because just over there is Lyra's bench, which is where Lyra Blackwell, the hero of the Philip Pullman Dark Materials books, starts her adventures. Also just behind me in the distance you may be able to see the tip of Magdalen College Tower. One of the fellows there was C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. Just behind me in the distance is Merton College, which is the site of where The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit was written by J.R.R. Tolkien. And we're right next to the beautiful River Cherwell, where punting happens in Oxford, so you may be able to see it just over my shoulder here. And the river has been a site of inspiration for many authors that have lived and worked around here, including Kenneth Grahame's Wind in the Willows and A.A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh books. Now, I'm fascinated by stories, and I think it's a great question to start with by asking, what are stories? But to give you a way into such a big and complex puzzle, we need to do some deconstructive analysis. And a good way to do that is to start by posing supplementary questions to the big question. In other words, try and sort of break it down into smaller bite-sized questions. A good place to start is with the question word itself, what. We can substitute that for a range of other w-sounding words. In other words, words that also have wh in it that are also question words. So things like when, how, by whom, and so forth, in order to try and get at the mystery of the bigger question, which is, what are stories? So for example, we could start with, well, when are stories? When do we have evidence of storytelling in human history? Well, basically for as long as we have any histories at all, we have seen human beings tell stories. So it gives us a sense that storytelling is something almost intrinsic to the human condition. So that gives us a nice insight into what stories are by even considering when stories are. What about how are stories? How are stories constructed, and how are they propagated? How do people come up with their ideas? Well, we might say that people like C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien had extraordinary imaginations. Well, but then that begs another question, which is, well, what is imagination? And does everyone have that same capability of perceiving unseen worlds in their mind's eye? And that leads to a further question, which is, by whom are these stories written? Is it something that is available to anybody, or is it something that people that are particularly lucky, perhaps they have sufficient time to think about these amazing universes and worlds, that they have the privilege, if you like, to come up with some of these ideas, some of these stories? Or is it much more democratic than that? Is it the sort of thing that literally anyone could come up with? So we've considered some of the when questions, some of the how questions, some of the by whom questions. So now we can start to get a real grip into what are stories. But we can again start to deconstruct the question further by saying, well, now we can add more words to the question. So perhaps we can say something like, well, what are stories to you? What do they mean to you as an individual? And what is your favourite story? That brings in a whole new subjective element into it, because now you're the key person in the consideration. So have a good think about the sort of stories that you find compelling and why you find them so compelling. And that might give you a sense as to what, more broadly, the market for stories looks like. I mean, for example, Stories that take us out of our own lives are often very popular. There are lots of stories that entail supernatural individuals or people with super social capabilities. In other words, very, very unusual characters. Because I suppose reading a story about someone who is quite usual or normal may not, for many readers, take them sufficiently outside of their current day-to-day existence to be compelling enough. Then there are other stories that have a deeper moral tale to tell, and so those are stories that are perhaps themselves asking and trying to answer big complex questions. Take something like the Bible, essentially a series of compelling and interesting stories to help untangle very complex moral and philosophical principles. The Bible could have been written just as a code of laws, as if it was a rule book that would be given out by a government or a school. But I don't imagine that it would have had the same sort of compulsive readership if that had been the way the Bible had been presented. So there's something quite entertaining about storytelling, something a bit more compelling that can achieve a similar goal as another medium like a law book, but through a much more accessible format. So that's an interesting thing to think about with regards to stories. So now we can come all the way back around to the original big question and say, well, what are stories there for? Well, stories have multiple purposes. They can sometimes be just for pure entertainment, sometimes they can have other goals in mind, such as education or even compulsion of a particular set of the population. That they are important not only in themselves but also for people, and so they can have a subjective impact, so they have different impacts depending on who does them. And they seem to have been around for as long as they've been human beings, so they seem to have something important to tell us about ourselves as a species, that we like to present complex ideas through the format of a story. Anyway, that's my big question, and I hope you've seen how through changing the words at the start, the who's, the how's, the when's, the by whom's, the what's and all the rest of it, I could deconstruct the bigger question into smaller, more bite-sized, accessible questions. And then I added more words like, what is your favourite story, to try and make the question a bit more personal, a bit more interesting. And ultimately what we were trying to do was answer that one big question, but in a way that was a bit more manageable and hopefully a bit more interesting. So what I want you to do is to try and do the same. Try and come up with a big question and deconstruct it down into 10 or so supplementary questions, and just see what insights you glean about the big question, not by trying to answer it straight off the bat, but just by trying to ask lots more questions around it. And hopefully you'll see that you will find more avenues and angles to your problem that can actually bring it to life and strangely make it easier to answer, paradoxically, even though you've been asking more questions. So give it a try, see how it works out, let me know how you get along in the comments. Thanks for watching, all the best, bye now.